Just a night nurse. That's what Dr. Caldwell called her when he thought she couldn't hear his voice carrying down the corridor at St. Michael's Hospital in Raleigh at 2:47 a.m. Just a night nurse who kept her head down and never made waves. He had no idea what those hands had held. He didn't know that the woman moving through ICU Bay 7 had spent 16 hours closing wounds on men he'd never heard of in a hospital that didn't exist. They didn't know. None of them knew. Margaret Walsh had worked the night shift at St. Michael's for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, not that she was counting. Time moved differently when you'd already lived a lifetime in someone else's body. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as she moved through the intensive care unit, her badge reading Margaret Walsh, RN, issued 2021, a name that was real except for everything that mattered. The antiseptic smell of the hospital, bleach and copper and something chemical she could never quite name, had become the smell of safety. Or at least the smell of invisibility. She arrived at 10 p.m. for the night shift, punched in at the time clock, and walked toward her locker in the staff room without speaking to anyone. Her colleagues learned quickly not to wait for her at lunch. Someone would gather their sandwich and a drink and sit down across from her, and within 30 seconds they'd remember something urgent elsewhere, some vital task in another part of the hospital that required their immediate attention. It was a pattern. Margaret had learned not to take it personally. People could sense things about you without knowing what they were sensing. They could smell the difference between ordinary and classified. Her locker was the third from the left, dented from years of other people's carelessness. She spun the combination, the 23rd of July, 14, a date that would mean nothing to anyone else, and the door swung open to reveal the same sparse inventory she maintained with military precision. 2 extra scrubs, folded into thirds. A pair of compression socks. A cardigan she never wore because it made her look approachable. And underneath everything, wrapped in clear plastic the way she'd wrapped it 8 years ago, the folded flag from Baghdad. 13 stars. No name stitched inside. No inscription, no rank, no unit designation. Just a triangle of fabric with its white stars on a field of blue, precisely folded the way the mortuary affairs officer had shown her the day they placed it in her hands and told her to disappear. She touched it through the plastic before each shift, her fingers tracing the outline of the fold, and then she pushed it aside and went to work being someone she wasn't. The ICU was full that night. 7 beds occupied, each one containing someone broken in ways that medicine was supposed to fix. Margaret moved between them with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory, which was really just scars remembering what hands had learned to do under pressure. She started 4s without hesitation, adjusting central lines and checking ventilator settings with the calm focus of someone who'd done worse things in worse places. Her fingers moved like they were reading a language only she understood. One motion. Precise. No wasted movement. At 3:15 a.m., Dr. Caldwell arrived for early rounds, which was unusual because Caldwell didn't typically show his face until sunrise. He preferred the morning shift when the administrative offices were full and he could be observed making important decisions. Margaret was in Bay 4, attending to a post-op patient from the thoracic surgery wing, when she heard the door open and felt that particular heaviness that always arrived with him. She didn't look up. Looking up only encouraged conversation. He approached the bedside, his shoes clicking on the linoleum tile with the rhythm of authority. Click, click. Click, click. The sound of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged anywhere. Margaret finished checking the chest tube output, a clear yellow-tinged fluid, exactly what it should be, before she acknowledged his presence with a slight turn of her head. "Good morning, Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice kept low and flat, the kind of voice that apologized for existing. He said nothing in response, which was worse than speech. He studied her hands for 17 seconds, she counted without meaning to, as she adjusted the tube position, her fingers steady as she worked. She could feel his eyes cataloging something, filing it away in that dangerous mind of his. Dr. James Caldwell had been chief of surgery at St. Michael's for 9 years. He controlled the surgical schedule, the fellowship placements, the committee assignments that determined who rose and who stayed invisible. Power like that didn't make people generous. It made them threatened by anyone who knew how to move without being told. The patient stirred, a woman named Diane Reeves who'd come in for a bleeding aneurysm repair 2 days prior. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder, checking the bear hugger warming blanket, ensuring the core temperature was climbing the way it should. Everything about this patient was stable because Margaret had maintained it that way all night. The vital signs on the monitor read like poetry to her: oxygen saturation 98%, blood pressure holding at 118/76, heart rate steady at 62. The endotracheal tube was positioned perfectly. The pain management was calibrated to keep the patient comfortable without suppressing her breathing. It was good work. Excellent work. Dr. Caldwell continued staring at her hands. Then he looked at her face, and his expression shifted into something that resembled understanding. He saw weakness. He saw a woman who worked nights because she couldn't handle day shift pressure. He saw someone who kept her head down because she had something to hide, not realizing that the hiding itself was the thing that terrified him. Fear of someone quiet. Fear of someone who didn't need his validation. Fear masquerading as authority. "Adjust the sedation," he said. It wasn't a request. Margaret didn't hesitate. She increased the midazolam drip by 0.2 milliliters per hour, which was unnecessary and would keep the patient over-sedated, but challenging Dr. Caldwell's orders was how you became the problem instead of the person doing the work. She'd learned that particular lesson in a lot of hard places. The new sedation would make Mrs. Reeves sleep deeper than she needed to. It would delay her waking and recovery. But it would prove to Dr. Caldwell that Margaret Walsh was the kind of nurse who understood her place in the hierarchy. He left the bay at 3:33 a.m., his shoes clicking away down the corridor, and Margaret waited exactly 120 seconds before decreasing the sedation back to therapeutic levels. The patient needed to wake up. The patient needed to heal. The work was the work, and the work was all Margaret had. At 4:47 a.m., a trauma admission came through the emergency department. Car accident on I-40. 23-year-old male with a pneumothorax that had started in the field and was getting worse. The ED resident called upstairs, his voice tight with the pitch of someone who knew they were in over their head. Margaret heard the overhead page, respiratory, ICU 2, stat, and she was already moving. She reached ICU Bay 2 before the surgical team. The patient was being wheeled in on a stretcher, his left side collapsed like a deflated balloon, oxygen saturation dropping every minute. The monitor showed 89%. Then 85. The kid was in his 20s, built like he spent his free time in gyms, and his body was betraying him in real time. Margaret moved alongside the stretcher before anyone else got there, her eyes already assessing. Small pneumothorax initially. Now it was progressing. Small vessels. High arterial flow. Needle decompression wouldn't hold long enough to get him to the OR. "We need to get a chest tube in," she said quietly, looking at the surgical intern who'd come with the patient. "Now." The intern hesitated. Margaret already had the supplies. She'd grabbed an 8 French chest tube, the catheter kit, the local anesthesia, everything she would need in case the surgeon didn't arrive in the next 90 seconds. She knew they wouldn't. This was a trauma case on a night shift. The trauma surgeon was 10 minutes away minimum. The patient had maybe 5 minutes before the pneumothorax became a tension pneumothorax. At that point, the heart would start to shift. Blood pressure would crash. And everything would change very fast. A voice behind her said, "I've got it." But Margaret was already moving. She'd already prepped the chest tube insertion site with betadine, already found the 5th intercostal space at the mid-axillary line, already positioned the patient for optimal entry. Her hands moved the way they always moved, like they were remembering something they'd never forgotten. The needle went in. The hiss of the guide wire sliding through. The tube positioning. And just like that, the patient could breathe again. The oxygen saturation climbed, 75. 82, 88. 94, stable. The trauma surgeon arrived 47 seconds later, and Margaret stepped back, removing her gloves with a snap that sounded like a small gunshot in the sudden quiet. She'd already suctioned the tube, confirmed placement, secure the drainage collection chamber. The work was done. The work was always done before anyone asked her to do it. Good tube placement, the surgeon said, looking at the chest X-ray that the radiology tech had already taken. Really good work. Margaret nodded once. He'll need close monitoring. Breath sounds asymmetrical on the left side. Watch for reaccumulation. She turned to leave, back to her other patients, and that's when someone grabbed her wrist. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She just stopped moving and waited, her expression blank as frosted glass. A man in scrubs that didn't belong to anyone she recognized was standing there. Older, maybe mid-50s, built lean like someone who'd spent his life in motion. He was staring at her with an intensity that made most people uncomfortable. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked like he was reading something written in a language he thought had been lost. "You were in Baghdad, weren't you?" His voice was quiet. It was a question but not a question. It was recognition. It was a whisper. Margaret didn't answer. She simply looked down at where his hand gripped her wrist, and he released her. She walked back to ICU bay for where Mrs. Reeves was sleeping the way people sleep when they're finally safe, and she didn't think about the question again. Or she thought about it constantly. It was hard to tell the difference with some things. At 6:15 a.m., when the night shift was ending and day shift was beginning, Margaret returned to her locker one final time. She opened the door, touched the flag through its plastic wrapping, and said a prayer to a God she'd stopped believing in somewhere between Fallujah and here. The prayer wasn't really a prayer. It was more like bearing witness. Like remembering. Like keeping 13 stars folded in a locker in Raleigh, North Carolina, as an act of defiance against a world that said you had to forget in order to survive. She clocked out at 6:47 a.m. 8 hours and 47 minutes of being someone else. 8 hours and 47 minutes of precise, invisible competence. 8 hours and 47 minutes of preparing for something everyone else had no idea was coming. Dr. Caldwell would be in the hospital at 7:30 a.m. for morning rounds. He would find Margaret's work. He would see the evidence of her skills. And something about the way she'd moved through his hospital with such assured command would begin to terrify him in ways he didn't yet understand. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the man with the recognition in his eyes, the one who'd asked about Baghdad in a voice so quiet only Margaret could hear, was walking toward the staff break room right now, and he was about to sit down at the table where Margaret made coffee and didn't speak to anyone. The break room smelled like reheated coffee and institutional decay, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Margaret pushed through the door with her lunch container, a small thing that held exactly 3 hours of fuel, rice, grilled chicken, steamed broccoli. No flavor. Fuel. 7 staff members occupied the scattered tables. 1 nurse sat by the window with a sandwich. 2 residents clustered near the refrigerator. A charge nurse from days spread out her meal across 4 chairs like she owned the room. Margaret's arrival changed the air pressure. She didn't look at anyone. She moved to the small round table in the corner, the one nobody claimed on day shift, the one that hummed under the most aggressive section of lighting. She Saturday. Opened her container. The smell of reheated chicken rose like steam. Within 90 seconds, the sandwich nurse stood. Gathered her plate, her napkin, her water bottle. Left without a word. The 2 residents whispered something neither could be bothered to muffle, then followed. The charge nurse made an elaborate show of checking her phone, sighing, then collecting her meal in dramatic handfuls. Gone. Margaret chewed. Swallowed. Didn't look up. By the second week, the pattern was so choreographed it could have been ballet. The moment her badge swiped the break room door, a cascade of departures began. Someone would always stand first, always Rodriguez, the combat medic, though Margaret noticed his hands trembled slightly as he gathered his things. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Nobody would. The junior nurses were easier to read. They'd whisper, always audible enough that Margaret could hear, "Caldwell says she's dangerous." Caldwell says she doesn't follow protocols. Caldwell says if you cross her, the sentence never finished, because they disappear through the door before completing the threat they'd been fed. Margaret understood the mechanics. This was a standard isolation protocol. Remove the target's social infrastructure. Make them visible through absence. Force them to eat alone under lights bright enough to interrogate confession. It was effective. She'd seen it used on soldiers who'd witnessed things that needed forgetting. Break the horizontal bonds first. The vertical ones, authority, hierarchy, the chains that mattered, those would follow. She bit into broccoli that had the texture of old rubber. Pain was information. Loneliness was information. The fact that Rodriguez couldn't hold her gaze meant something was breaking inside him, something about loyalty and self-preservation fighting for dominance. On Thursday, the third week, Margaret arrived for the evening shift and found the break room empty. She went through the hallway toward the unit board, the cork panel where schedules lived and announcements died. Staff clustered around it like vultures. A formal write-up. Her name at the top in printed letters. Dr. Caldwell's signature at the bottom, dated and witnessed by 2 nurse managers. 16 documented infractions in red ink. Margaret read every word. Her eyes tracked left to right, top to bottom, no expression on her face. The staff watched her. They wanted to see something crack. A jaw clench. A hand tremor. A flash of humiliation creeping up the throat. She removed the paper from the board. Folded it precisely into thirds. Then once more. Then once more again until it was a small rectangle of white and red ink. Placed it in her scrub pocket. Dr. Caldwell watched from his office window, 15 feet away, smiling like a man who'd just watched a house burn. He'd been building this case for months, each minor deviation, each moment she didn't defer, each time she made a clinical decision that worked but didn't follow his preferred protocol. He documented it all. 3 inches of paper, the hospital's rulebook weaponized into her execution sword. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. The emergency department doors burst open at 2,147 hours. Margaret was in Emma's ICU room, reviewing the monitor readings, assessing pupil response, running through a mental catalogue of what 3 failing hospitals had already tried and abandoned. Emma Reeves lay motionless on the bed, 17 years old, the kind of beautiful that made people angry about God and cruelty and the randomness of seizure disorders. 2 weeks in a coma. 2 weeks of her father sitting in a plastic chair, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. A Marine lieutenant commander moved through the corridors like a man carrying the weight of his entire battalion on his shoulders. Dress uniform. Jaw set. Eyes that had seen Helmand Province and Cunha Valley and places that didn't have names, only coordinates. Margaret heard the commotion before she saw him. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm of someone who'd marched 1,000,000 miles and would march 1,000,000 more. Jacob Reeves appeared in the doorway, and Margaret understood in 3 seconds what the chart had tried to explain in 15 pages. 3 hospitals had transferred his daughter here because their hope had expired. Mayo Clinic had said it was progressive. Johns Hopkins had said it was terminal. A facility in Chapel Hill had said manage comfort care and prepare for end of life. His eyes found Margaret's, and something in her stillness, the way she stood beside the monitor, the way her hands rested on the bed rail with the confidence of someone who'd held life together with bare hands before, made him stop walking. "You've seen this before," he said. Not a question. Margaret didn't answer. She turned back to Emma's chart. Scanned the notes from the previous hospitals, the interventions that had failed, the medications they'd tried in escalating doses. Progressive cerebral edema. Multi-system involvement. A prognosis written in declining numbers. Over the next 72 hours, Margaret began something that looked like heresy to the resident physicians. She adjusted fluid management, more aggressive than textbook, more specific than Caldwell's written orders. She repositioned Emma every 90 minutes instead of the mandated 4-hour rotation, noting that certain positions seemed to correlate with slightly better oxygenation. She reviewed Caldwell's medication timing and noted, in her assessment section, that the intervals might be contributing to fluctuating intracranial pressure. No physician would argue with her observations. But every deviation from protocol was another thread in the rope Caldwell was weaving. On the second morning, Emma's right lung began to collapse. Pneumothorax, air leaking into the space between lung and chest wall, compressing the tissue, making each breath count down toward suffocation. The resident called for a chest tube. Called for the attending. Margaret was already moving. She found the landmarks, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the way a combat medic finds it in a field hospital without lights. Hand steady. Motion economical. Rodriguez watched from the doorway, the former army medic with guilt written across his face for abandoning her in the break room, and he saw her thread the needle with a precision that only comes from repetition under pressure. The hiss of air escaping. The pressure equalizing. Emma's oxygen saturation climbing, 78 to 82 to 87 to 92. Stable. Rodriguez whispered something so quiet it was almost breath. You were in Baghdad, weren't you? Margaret's hands didn't stop moving. She secured the tube. Taped it down. Made a note in the chart. No answer. But Rodriguez had his answer anyway, in her silence, in the way she'd moved like a woman who'd done this 100 times before, in the scars on her hands that told stories nobody was supposed to know. Dr. Caldwell arrived at the bedside 10 minutes later, reviewed the chart, and found Margaret's notes. He read each one. His face changed colors like a bruise developing. He called her to the hallway. Quiet voice. Dangerous. You're experimenting on a dying girl to play hero, he said. Stop. Follow my protocols exactly or I'll have you removed from this case. Margaret met his eyes. Her voice dropped an octave, the shift so subtle that nobody else heard it, but Caldwell felt it like a pressure change before a storm. Your protocols are why 3 hospitals failed, she said. His face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then turned and walked away, because he'd suddenly understood something that made the anger even worse. She wasn't defending herself. She wasn't arguing protocol. She wasn't explaining her clinical reasoning. She was simply stating fact. And that terrified him more than anything she could have said. Emma was scheduled for a routine drainage procedure the next morning. Caldwell personally signed on as the attending. Lieutenant Commander Jacob Reeves arrived at St. Michael's at 6:47 a.m. with his 17-year-old daughter Emma cradled against his chest like she weighed nothing. The man wore a dress uniform, dress blues with ribbons stacked above his left pocket, and he moved through the hospital corridors with the economical precision of someone who had learned to navigate hostile terrain. Emma's body hung limp in his arms. She had been seizing for 3 weeks straight, a seizure disorder that spiraled beyond the reach of 4 different anticonvulsants. 3 hospitals had transferred her. 3 hospitals had told him the same thing, we can't help her. She's coded twice. She won't survive another transfer. But Jacob Reeves was a Marine, and Marines don't accept the word can't. Margaret first saw them in the ICU hallway outside Emma's room. The girl's head lolled against her father's shoulder, dark hair matted with the sweat of continuous seizure activity. A hospital gown hung loose on her frame. She'd lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks, muscle wasting from the constant neurological storm. Her skin had taken on the waxy translucence of someone whose body was beginning to shut down. Margaret had seen that look before. In combat triage tents. In the seconds before someone didn't make it. She did not stop walking. She did not acknowledge them. But her eyes caught the ribbons on the Marine's chest as she passed, a Bronze Star, 2 Commendation Medals, and a purple sliver she recognized as a Purple Heart. When she reached Emma's room, Margaret pulled the girl's preoperative scans and clipped them onto the light box with the deliberate care of someone performing a ritual. The MRI showed Emma's brain scarred with seizure activity, neural pathways overloaded and misfiring like a building's electrical system shorting under catastrophic load. The CT showed something else. Something dangerous. There was fluid accumulation in Emma's right pleural cavity, blood and lymphatic fluid building pressure around her lung. The drainage site needed placement, and Caldwell had ordered a percutaneous catheter insertion for this morning. But the location he'd marked on the procedural plan was positioned 3 millimeters from the pericardium, the sac surrounding Emma's heart. 3 millimeters. In a seizing girl whose chest wall was moving with involuntary contractions. A needle inserted at the wrong angle, or twisted even slightly during the procedure, would puncture straight through into cardiac tissue. Margaret pulled up the 3D reconstruction of Emma's chest cavity and rotated it slowly. There was a better placement site, 5 centimeters lateral, safer margin, same drainage efficiency. She printed the images and walked to Caldwell's office without knocking. The office smelled like expensive cologne and the recycled air of someone who preferred closed doors. Caldwell sat behind his desk reviewing his own procedural notes, and he did not look up. The drainage placement, Margaret said. Emma's anatomy suggests a safer approach. Caldwell's pen kept moving across his notepad. My approach is sound, Nightingale. The pericardium sits closer than your plan accounts for. 3 millimeters to the intended insertion point. During the procedure, any movement will be managed by me. He finally looked up, and his eyes carried the flat indifference of a man who had decided this conversation ended before it began. You're a nurse. A talented one, perhaps. But your role is to observe and learn, not to dictate surgical planning. I've performed this procedure 214 times. I've never perforated a pericardium. And I'm not about to start with a 17-year-old girl. He returned his attention to his notes. Emma scheduled at 8 o'clock. Be in the procedure room by 7:30. And Nightingale, don't mention your concerns to the family. Their anxiety is our enemy right now. She stood in his office for 3 more seconds. The fluorescent overhead light cast his face in sharp shadows, and she could see the calculation running beneath his composure. He was already constructing the narrative in case something went wrong. The incompetent nurse who suggested changes to his plan. The documentation trail proving his technique was superior. The protection he was building, brick by brick, in advance of disaster. Margaret turned and walked out without responding. The procedure room was cold. Someone had set the thermostat to 64 degrees, which kept the surgical team comfortable but made Emma's small body shiver under the warming blankets. Margaret had arrived at 7:16 and began her setup with a systematic precision that had kept her alive in Baghdad. Check everything, assume everything will fail, prepare for the worst outcome. She positioned the drainage collection system, verified the suction pressure, laid out the sterile field. At 7:47, she reviewed Emma's scans one final time on the mobile imaging station, and her hands moved to the images without conscious decision. The 3D reconstruction rotated slowly, the pericardium glowing a luminous blue in the digital overlay. So close. The needle insertion site Caldwell had planned was so close. Caldwell arrived at 7:58, already gloved, moving with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own judgment. He did not glance at the scans Margaret had repositioned on the wall. He did not acknowledge the alternative placement she had prepared. He simply positioned himself at Emma's right side, needle in hand, and began. Prep the site, he said. Margaret swabbed the skin with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell sharp and chemical. She could feel the moment something shifted in the room's air pressure, that peculiar sensation when multiple people realize, simultaneously, that something is about to be irrevocably wrong. Lieutenant Commander Reeves was in the waiting room upstairs. Emma's mother was in the cafeteria drinking her third coffee, unable to watch. Only Margaret understood what was happening. Caldwell inserted the needle. It went in smoothly, found the fluid collection, and for a moment it seemed his confidence had been justified. Then he advanced the catheter guide wire, rotated the angle slightly to better access the fluid pocket, and the needle tracking changed. Margaret watched the trajectory shift. Watched the centimeters shrink. 1 centimeter from the pericardium. 0.5 centimeter. Doctor, the trajectory, Margaret's voice was low, professional, a statement not a question. Quiet, Caldwell said. The needle punctured through. The blood that flooded the drainage tube was not the dark venous blood of a pleural effusion. It was bright arterial red, the color of something that should never leave the chamber surrounding a beating heart. Emma's blood pressure dropped instantly, 82/54 to 70/40 in the space of 4 heartbeats. The monitor's rhythm began to fragment. The room understood before anyone in it did. Caldwell stared at the needle in his hand and the blood dripping from its hub. His face had gone the color of hospital walls. He opened his mouth to speak and no sound emerged. Margaret did not wait for hierarchy. She did not wait for permission. She had learned in Baghdad that hesitation in the first 90 seconds meant someone was dead. She hit the code button with her palm and announced, "Pericardial tamponade, we need to open her chest now," and her voice was no longer the voice of a night nurse. It was the voice of someone who had given orders under fire. A surgical resident bolted toward the crash cart. A perfusionist appeared in the doorway. Caldwell stammered something about needing to consult, needing to stabilize first, needing to review options. But there were no options. There was only the mathematics of cardiac pressure and the 90-second window before Emma's heart would stop beating beneath the weight of her own blood. Margaret was already gloving up. She prepped the left chest wall with antiseptic, the iodine solution turning Emma's skin a deep orange. The scalpel was in her hand before the resident returned with the crash cart. She could feel the weight of every person in the room, the attending, the nurses, the residents, all of them frozen in the singular moment where the junior staff member makes the decision that senior staff was too afraid to make. Her hands hovered above Emma's chest. The monitors screamed. Caldwell stood paralyzed 3 feet away, still holding the needle that had begun the end of his career, watching a Marine's daughter's chest wall waiting for a scalpel in the hands of a nurse he had spent 6 weeks trying to destroy. The scalpel was already in her hand. She didn't remember drawing it from the tray, but muscle memory operated on its own frequency now, the frequency of a combat medic who'd learned to move while thinking shut down completely. The monitors screamed their electronic wail, a sound like tearing metal, and Margaret made the incision. Median sternotomy. Straight line down the center of Emma's sternum, precise as a laser, blood welling immediately but controllable, the kind of bleeding that meant she'd hit it exactly right. 40 seconds. That's all it took. Her hands moved like they were operating on autopilot, which they were, the hands of someone who'd closed wounds on men better than anyone in this room would ever be. She reached for the rib spreader. The stainless steel was cold against her palms, slick with blood. The spreader's handles were familiar in a way that made Caldwell finally move, not toward her, but away. He backed against the far wall, his gloved hand still raised, the expression on his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked like the recognition of his own obsolescence. Margaret cranked the spreader. The ribs separated with a soft, deliberate cracking sound, like green wood bending but not breaking, and Emma's chest cavity opened before them. Blood. Thick, dark blood filling the pericardium like a balloon ready to burst, compressing the heart that should have been beating but wasn't. Emma's monitor showed a flat line except for the artifact of movement, the display of a heart drowning in its own fluid. Margaret didn't pause. She didn't speak. She reached in with her bare hands, her gloved fingers finding the pericardium's tough membrane, and evacuated the blood with precision, pulling the fluid away from the compressed organ beneath. The surgical resident assisting, a kid named Torres who'd been watching her with something between awe and terror, handed her supplies without being asked, as if they were connected by something deeper than protocol. The heart was visible now, compressed and pale, a fist that had forgotten how to clench. Margaret placed her fingers on either side of the left ventricle and began direct cardiac massage. Rhythmic compressions, her fingers working with the absolute precision of someone who'd performed this exact procedure on a Marine Corps private in a dust storm outside Fallujah while IED explosions rocked the ground 300 meters away. 1, 2, 3. The compressions were firm, controlled, nothing frantic about them. Pain was information. Information was survival. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The room had stopped existing for everyone except her and Emma. Even Caldwell had stopped existing, though he stood frozen against the wall like a man watching his own execution playing out in real time. 3 minutes. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign that her cardiovascular system was working harder than intended, that adrenaline was flooding her nervous system in ways that civilian medical training never prepared you for. But her hands didn't waver. They never wavered. For minutes. Emma's heart shivered. Once. The organ contracted weakly, a hesitation, a question mark in electrical pulses. Twice. The ventricle contracted again, stronger this time, and the monitors erupted into a rhythm, not perfect, not yet stable, but alive. The sinus rhythm was there, faint but present, a song the heart was remembering how to sing. Margaret stepped back, breathing steady, her hands covered in blood up to the wrists like she was wearing crimson gloves. She sutured the pericardium closed with motions that were automatic, meditative, each stitch placed with the kind of precision that only came from having done something 10,000 times before. The blood was cleaning away now, revealing the sealed chamber beneath, the heart's armor intact. Emma's vitals climbed. 62 beats per minute. Blood pressure 94/52 and rising. O2 saturation climbing toward normal range. The monitors shifted from the shriek of death to the measured beeping of survival. The room exhaled as one organism, but Margaret was already moving toward the suture tray, already assessing what else needed closing, what other damage Caldwell's incompetence had caused. Torres stared at her like she'd just performed magic, but there was no magic here, only training that had cost more than most people could imagine to acquire. Dr. Caldwell was gone. She noticed his absence the way a leopard notices the absence of prey, a gap where something had been, a movement toward the door that no one else seemed to have witnessed. He'd fled during the save, backing out of the trauma bay while Margaret was still working, his career imploding in real time while she performed miracles with her bare hands. The surgical resident whispered something that might have been gratitude or might have been shock. Margaret didn't respond. She finished the closure, removed her gloves with a snapping sound that echoed in the sudden quiet, and turned toward the door. Emma would be moved to cardiac ICU. Emma would wake up. Emma would live because Margaret had remembered how to break open a chest and restart a heart. 6 hours later, security was waiting at the administrative office on the 3rd floor. She wasn't surprised. Predictability was a luxury that people with something to lose could afford, and Caldwell had just watched his entire existence be dismantled by a night shift nurse with hands that belonged to someone he'd been systematically trying to destroy. Of course he would run toward the only institution that might still protect him. The hospital board sat in their conference room like judges convening for a sentencing, 5 men and 2 women, all in business casual, all holding the same 3-inch stack of papers that Caldwell was distributing with the precision of a prosecutor building a death penalty case. The stack landed on the table in front of Margaret's chair. She didn't sit down. Dr. Caldwell's voice was ice, carefully modulated, the tone of a man who'd learned to weaponize bureaucracy like a surgeon wields a scalpel. Unauthorized surgical intervention by non-physician personnel, he read from the incident report, his finger tracking down the page. Violation of Hospital Protocol 7.3.2. Violation of state medical licensing requirements. Violation of the 1987 federal regulation prohibiting individuals without appropriate credentials from performing open-chest surgical procedures. He paused. The pause was theatrical. You don't have a medical license, Ms. Walsh. You're a nurse. That means you're not authorized to perform surgery. That means what you did was not only dangerous, it was criminal. The board members exchanged looks. The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it, as Margaret's grandfather used to say about the quiet before an ambush. She could see the calculations happening in their faces, the liability, the lawsuits, the insurance implications, the regulatory nightmare that would follow if they didn't move decisively against her. Caldwell had constructed his case with the precision of a man who'd spent 6 weeks building a legal fortress around himself, brick by bureaucratic brick. The incident report cited every minor violation he'd documented over months, failure to report through proper chain of command on 4 occasions. Deviation from standard protocols on 7 documented instances. Insubordination toward attending physician on 5 separate dates. He'd CSIT legal. He'd CSIT risk management. He'd copied the state medical board and included a notation about filing a complaint for practicing medicine without a license. Margaret understood then that she was not just being fired. She was being erased. Caldwell had weaponized the entire institutional apparatus against her, and she could do nothing about it because any attempt to defend herself by revealing her true credentials would blow open a classified operation, would expose military intelligence directives, would violate the orders that had been given to her when they'd scrubbed her records clean and told her never to surface. The board chairman, a woman named Henderson with steel-grey hair and the expression of someone performing a necessary evil, gestured toward the security officers flanking the doorway. "Your badge has been deactivated," she said quietly. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately. We'll need you to turn over any hospital property you're carrying. The security team will escort you from the building." Margaret didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't speak at all. She simply turned and walked out while Caldwell watched from his chair with the expression of a man who'd just survived an assassination attempt. The termination papers were placed into a manila envelope. Her access badge was confiscated. The walk to the parking lot felt like moving through water, everything distant and slow, though she knew from her training that adrenaline was wearing off and her perception was normalizing. Time was returning to standard speed, which meant the whole nightmare had only taken about 4 hours. That night, the rain came down like someone was pouring it from a bucket held by an angry god. Margaret stood at the bus stop on Fayetteville Street, water streaming from her hair, clutching a cardboard box containing the entire inventory of her civilian life. The mug, chipped on one side, bearing the legend "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering, sat next to a dying succulent with leaves that had gone brown weeks ago. And underneath, a photograph. 5 people in desert fatigues, standing in front of a field hospital that was just a tent and some hope. One face was circled in pen, Second Lieutenant James Reeves, call sign Cypher, who'd taken an IED round that was meant for her and had bled out on the floor of that same tent while Margaret tried to hold his chest together with her hands and bandages and a prayer she didn't believe in anymore. She stared at her reflection in a puddle at her feet, rain distorting her face into something abstract and unrecognizable. 23 years of service. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross that nobody would ever see, locked in a safe deposit box in a bank under a name that didn't exist. And now, apparently, nothing. A ghost in scrubs. A woman who'd saved a Marine's daughter's life with skills the hospital had just fired her for possessing. She wondered, standing in the rain with the box getting soggy and the photograph threatening to dissolve, if staying invisible was worth becoming nothing. If the cost of survival was the same as the cost of death. 3 days passed. Margaret didn't answer her phone. She sat in a motel room on the wrong side of Raleigh, counting money she shouldn't have been carrying and wondering if the military would come for her the way they'd come for her once before, with orders that sounded like suggestions and decisions that sounded like mandates. The photograph was drying on the nightstand next to a glass of water she hadn't drunk. The news played on a muted television, weather, local interest stories, traffic advisories. Normal life, continuing without her, the way it always did. 3 days passed like a held breath. Margaret stood in a convenience store on Elm Street, watching the television mounted above the register. The volume was muted. Captions ran across the bottom of the screen in that peculiar hospital light blue, the color of ICU ceilings at 3 in the morning. Her hands were steady as she read the words that shouldn't have been possible: decorated combat medic missing after classified mission declassified. Her photograph filled half the screen. The one from her military ID, the one she'd spent 18 years hiding behind false social security numbers and nursing credentials. The one she'd convinced herself nobody would ever see again. The clerk didn't recognize her. People never did. They saw a woman in scrubs standing motionless in the frozen food aisle, but they didn't see the person in the news banner. That gap, between her invisible present and her publicly exposed past, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff while the ground beneath her feet turned to water. The broadcast cut to the hospital lobby at St. Michael's. The morning shift was just beginning. Nurses and orderlies froze mid-stride as the story scrolled across the lobby television. Rodriguez was there, her mouth open. Henderson put her hand to her chest. They didn't know. None of them knew what they were standing next to. She turned away from the screen and left the store without buying anything. By evening, the story had metastasized across every local news feed in North Carolina. The sealed Pentagon file. The classified operation in Baghdad that went sideways. The testimony that couldn't be discussed, the mission that couldn't be named, the identity that was supposed to remain erased forever. Someone in the Justice Department had made a calculation. The defense contractor she'd testified against was finally arrested, finally going to trial, finally going to prison. The sealed case that had required her complete erasure could now be unsealed. The ghost could be declassified. The hospital's phone lines lit up like a switchboard from a different era. News vans arrived at St. Michael's before breakfast service. Security scrambled to maintain some semblance of order. The morning board meeting, scheduled for 9 a.m., became an emergency session at 8:15. Lieutenant Commander Reeves watched the broadcast in Emma's room. His daughter was still sedated, still healing, still impossible, the neurological recovery the attending physicians kept calling miraculous. When he saw Margaret's face on the screen, he stood up so fast the chair scraped backward against the floor tile with a sound like breaking glass. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call. He walked downstairs to the nurse's station where Rodriguez was sorting medications with trembling hands, and he spoke with a kind of quiet authority that comes from command. "Show me Margaret Walsh's employee file." The record showed everything. A social security number that didn't exist before 2019. A military background that couldn't be verified through any civilian database. An address in Raleigh that had been rented under a corporate LLC. A woman who'd been scrubbed from the world so thoroughly that the hospital had hired a ghost. The Navy SEAL commander arrived at 10:47 a.m. in dress blues that looked like he'd sewn them from moonlight and ceremony. His name tag read Clayton. His bearing had the terrifying fluid precision of a predator who'd learned violence wasn't about rage, it was about mathematics. He walked past security without being stopped. People didn't stop men like that. He entered the conference room where the hospital board had convened in an emergency session, and he closed the door so quietly you could hear the fluorescent bulbs humming in the walls. "Lieutenant Commander Margaret Walsh," he began, his voice like a tank idling in a secure garage, "earned a Bronze Star with Valor for holding a field hospital under fire for 16 hours in Fallujah. Alone. With 6 Marines wounded and 2 in critical condition. While rounds came through the walls." He paused. "She earned 2 Silver Stars. Once for conducting emergency surgery under active sniper fire. Once for carrying a wounded lieutenant commander through a collapsing building while maintaining operational security on classified intelligence she was carrying." Another pause. "Each one a nail in something being built. She earned a Navy Cross for preventing a courthouse bombing in Baghdad that would have killed 43 civilians." Dr. Caldwell sat at the far end of the conference table, and every word turned him to ash. "She also," Commander Clayton continued, "saved your chief of surgery's life once. In 2009. He doesn't remember her. She doesn't expect him to." He set a folder on the table. "But I do. And I remember everyone who saves my people." The FBI liaison, a woman named Santos with eyes that had seen too many classified briefings, explained the mechanism of Margaret's erasure. The testimony against the defense contractor. The witness protection protocols. The explicit orders never to surface, never to reveal her credentials, never to prove she'd existed at all. Margaret Walsh had been scrubbed from every military record, every hospital credential, every social security database. She'd become something less than a person. She'd become an absence. She couldn't defend herself, Santos said, looking directly at Caldwell, because revealing her identity would have compromised the case we were building. She had to let you destroy her reputation. She had to let you fire her. She had to disappear all over again. The board member named Henderson, the one who'd hired Margaret 3 years ago and had watched the 16-count write-up appear on the unit board, asked the question that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Dr. Caldwell, did you verify her credentials before beginning this termination process? Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. How could I have known? So you didn't, Henderson said quietly. You filed charges against someone whose qualifications you never verified. You built a paper case to destroy a nurse without understanding who she was. The second wind of the meeting moved to the records themselves. Every one of those 16 infractions examined. Medication given 3 minutes outside an arbitrary window. Forms initialed in pencil instead of pen. A protocol deviation that had, in fact, prevented a patient from coding. Each violation rendered microscopic, pathetic, the desperate grasping of a man building a coffin out of sawdust. Emma Reeves woke up at 2:34 p.m. in room for 12. Full consciousness. Full neurological recovery. The kind of outcome that made attending physicians check and recheck imaging because it shouldn't have been possible. Lieutenant Commander Reeves wept, not from the news of the lawsuit, not from the board decision, but from the fact that his daughter opened her eyes and recognized him. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, wrote in her chart, full neuro recovery. Attributed to immediate intervention during cardiac tamponade. Without emergency intervention, patient would not have survived. Lieutenant Commander Walsh's actions prevented catastrophic death. The statement Reeves gave to the news cameras was short and precise with the bearing of a Marine who'd learned to measure words like ammunition. Dr. Caldwell's error nearly killed my daughter. Margaret Walsh's courage saved her. Then he destroyed her career to cover his mistake. I came to this hospital because I was told it was the best. I'm leaving because I know it is, and it's because of one nurse who risked everything to save my child. The hospital board voted 7-0 for immediate termination. Caldwell was escorted from the building by security at 4:22 p.m., his belongings in a banker's box, his credentials suspended pending investigation, his professional reputation collapsing like a building taking demo charges. Rodriguez watched from the nurse's station. She didn't say anything. She just watched him leave and whispered something so quiet only the air heard it, you never saw her coming. By the next morning, the medical boards had opened investigations. By the afternoon, his license was suspended pending review. By Thursday, 3 previous hospitals had disclosed complaints of retaliatory termination, settled quietly, sealed quietly, the kind of institutional silence that protects the powerful until someone powerful enough decides otherwise. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. The moment everything changed happened at 6:14 p.m. on the evening of the board meeting, when Margaret's phone rang. She was standing at another bus stop, a different one this time, rain falling like applause on the pavement behind her. The number was blocked. She almost didn't answer. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, a voice said, "The hospital administrator, Mrs. Chen, we need to talk about your future." Margaret didn't speak for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the rain fell harder. In those 3 seconds, she understood that her past had finally caught up to her present, and that sometimes erasure isn't permanent. Sometimes the world changes. Sometimes the truth sets you free, even if you spent 18 years believing the truth would only chain you deeper. "I'm listening," Margaret said. She returned to St. Michael's on Monday morning through the front entrance, no cardboard box this time, no rainy bus stop, no invisible dissolution. Staff applauded as she walked through the lobby, spontaneous, genuine, the kind of applause that comes when people understand they'd been standing next to someone extraordinary and had finally been given permission to see it. Rodriguez was there. Henderson. The nurses from the night shift who'd eaten their lunches in silence just to avoid her isolation. They applauded, and Margaret walked through it like she was walking through normal air that happened to be full of sound and recognition and the strange gravity of being finally, impossibly seen. The hospital board issued a formal apology. Full reinstatement. Back pay for 3 days of wages that felt like 3 years. An offer to design trauma protocols for the entire Raleigh Medical Complex. A position training the next generation of trauma nurses, the future doctors and surgeons and intensive care specialists who would learn not from textbooks but from someone who'd written them in blood and field hospitals under fire. Margaret visited Emma's room at 2:47 p.m. on that Monday afternoon. Emma was awake, weak but smiling, the kind of smile that belongs only to people who've learned what it means to survive. Lieutenant Commander Reeves stood when Margaret entered. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't speak. He just stood, then rendered a formal salute, the kind they taught you in basic training, the kind that means everything gratitude has no words for. Margaret returned it, and in that exchange, something was sealed. A debt repaid. A life honored. A moment that didn't need language because it already had the weight of survival. "Thank you for not giving up on her," Reeves said. Margaret looked at him steady and level. "I never do." The folded flag, the one with 13 stars, the one from her fallen teammate, the one she'd kept in a locker for 3 years like it was contraband, was removed from its hiding place and set into a glass case on the wall of the surgical training wing. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "Lieutenant Commander Margaret Walsh, USN. In honor of those who serve in silence." The flag glowed under the display lighting like something sacred, like something that had finally been allowed to be exactly what it always was. 2 years later, someone spotted a man in a medical supply van driving through Raleigh. He was delivering bedpans and gauze to facilities that had once revered him. He was delivering gauze to St. Michael's, actually, on a Tuesday afternoon, and he saw Margaret's photograph in the hospital newsletter on the bulletin board near the loading dock. She was standing before a class of 20 trauma nursing students, teaching the exact hand position for cardiac massage. The article called her a hero. The article used the word decorated. The article explained that she was training the next generation of nurses in techniques learned under fire in Baghdad, techniques that had saved countless lives. He stared at that photograph for 7 seconds. Then he turned his van around and drove to another hospital. Margaret stood in St. Michael's surgical training wing, the flag behind her in its glass case, teaching a student named James the exact mechanics of direct cardiac compression. "You do it like this," she said, positioning his hands on the practice mannequin, because when there's no time and no backup, precision is the difference between life and death. Speed is good. Accuracy is better. Caring is everything. James, a 23-year-old pre-nursing student from Durham, asked the question that everyone eventually asks someone who carries that kind of visible authority. How do you stay calm? How do you not panic? Margaret looked at the flag behind her. She looked at the brass plaque with her rank and her service and her teammates' memory. She looked at James and she saw someone who was going to save lives, and she answered with the precision that comes from understanding exactly what you're protecting. You remember what you're fighting for. You remember that the person in front of you matters more than your fear. And you remember that training, good training, becomes muscle memory. Muscle memory becomes survival. She walked the night shift halls that evening, coffee cooling in her hand, checking on patients in rooms lit with the kind of soft fluorescent glow that only exists in hospitals at midnight. Invisible again, but this time by choice. A woman in scrubs moving through the darkness with the bearing of someone who'd learned long ago that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together. The ones who save lives while the world sleeps. The ones who know exactly what silence costs and why it's worth it. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time you were underestimated and proved everyone wrong, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone believe in you when you'd stopped believing in yourself? Because that's what happened to Margaret. And that's what changes everything.